This is the Coach Mark Gottfried Show, and it's my pleasure to bring you some high-achieving individuals who have done some amazing things in their lives. It's my goal that we can all learn from their journeys, the obstacles they've had to overcome, and the decisions they've had to make along their way to the successes that they've had. So I hope you enjoy the Coach Mark Gottfried Show. All right, welcome back. This is the Coach Mark Gottfried Show, and as always, I'm having an absolute ball. And today, I've got this phenomenal guest. His name is Dan Gavitt, and Dan is the Senior Vice President at the NCAA. And Dan, in my terms, runs the entire March Madness men's and women's basketball tournament. And so, Dan, it's just great to have you. Welcome into the show.
Mark, great to be with you. A longtime friend. Always good to see you and talk with you, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you. I think this is going to be really interesting for people because, you know, there's a lot of people that watch the tournament. You know, they fill out a bracket. They're into March Madness, and but a lot of times people really don't have any idea, you know, everything that goes into it, which it's a year-round endeavor for you and your staff. But before we dive into the tournament, tell me a little bit too, Dan, and again for our audience that's listening, Dan's father, Dave Gavitt, at one time was the commissioner of the Big East, and I want you to describe a little bit because you were young then, but really when Big East basketball got formed and you were a younger person watching your father and kind of how that all ties into your role that you have now at the NCAA.
Sure. Well, you know, I was lucky to have a great dad, better dad than he was a businessman and a coach and an administrator even. But it was kind of cool to be on the front row of his vision for this conference that's had such an historic run in college basketball called the Big East. He was part of his vision. He was the founder of the conference together with the other athletic directors of the original schools. And it was started in 1979, as you may recall, Mark. I was only 13 at the time, but I remember a lot about it, and certainly throughout my teenage years saw it grow very rapidly to be successful as early as 1985, where the Big East had 3 different teams in the Final Four. But right away in 1979, fans may recall also that was the year that ESPN started. So part of the success and the vision for the Big East Conference was to create a conference built around traditional Eastern college basketball powers that were also in big media markets, that had big television markets. And the corresponding time with ESPN starting had a lot to do with that. ESPN was looking for content, for games to put on their nascent network. And of course, the Big East was looking for exposure, not just regionally, but nationally. And even in California, you know, where I know you are, like, you know, there were fans in the early days of the Big East that used to watch Big Monday. I remember Mike Hopkins telling me that before he went to Syracuse. Part of the reason he went to Syracuse is because he used to run home from school and see Big East games on Big Monday as far away as California that Syracuse would play in. So it was kind of cool to have a front seat to all that. Some great players, of course, Patrick Ewing, Chris Mullin, Ed Pinckney, Pearl Washington. You know, the list is endless. And then the coaches, of course, just incredible Hall of Fame level coaches, Jim Boeheim, John Thompson, Louis Carnesecca, Rolly Massimino, the list goes on and on. Not just great coaches, but real characters as well. Jim Calhoun, certainly. So it was quite a vision that he had, and certainly the conference has had a great run even up to today.
Dan, when you were young, and, you know, I grew up as the son of a coach, and so I'm around the game, and then you were around it, you know, in your younger years and then in teenage years, but especially because I can remember it's almost like the coaches were like caricatures, you know, like they were bigger than life, you know, all of them were, they all were different, you know, John Thompson and Jim Boeheim and Rolly Massimino, you know, all those guys. But when you were younger, watching all that come together, could you see it like, or was it a little bit like, how's this all going to work out? Or, you know, how did you view it as a young person who was kind of had a front row seat to watching that kind of emerge?
Well, it's a good question, Mark. You know, I mean, first of all, those guys were all friends of my father's, right? My father had been a coach at Providence College, like your dad. had been, and he had actually coached against most of the original teams in the Big East and the original coaches in the Big East. So he had kind of a different relationship with them. I think they had a lot of trust in him as a colleague, as a competitor. So when he stepped away from coaching and started the conference as an athletic director, I think they trusted him, that he knew what they were going through and what he could do to help build something that's special for all the teams in the conference. Yeah, they were characters. There's no doubt about it. Larger than life, and pre-social media and everything else. Their characters shone through on ESPN and other media at the time. But I just thought that was normal. That was like every coach was like that, and yeah, they were remarkable when you think back to the programs that they started and how they developed into national powers. John Thompson maybe right at the top of that list. I mean, Georgetown had never had a whole lot of success, particularly in college basketball, maybe way back. But John Thompson was a high school coach and developed a national brand at a small Catholic university in Washington, D.C. That's remarkable. And Jim Boeheim, same thing. Never went to school at Syracuse, never left, and of course built that into a nationally recognized program that won a national championship, both those schools.
Dan, do you think, looking back, and we're going to get to talk about the tournament now pretty soon, but I still want to ask you another question. But looking back, and I coached for 30-something years, obviously, and there were guys I got along with that are coaches, and there were some guys, honestly, we used to joke around in the SEC, like if we all had guns, we'd have shot each other probably, because we got under each other's skin a lot. But it seemed like that group back then, and all of those guys who were so successful, they had done such a good job. But and I'm sure your father had a lot to do with it, but they seem to get it. Like, if we all promote this together, if we all buy into the Big East, if we all, do our part, everybody seems to win. And I'm going to guess that your dad had a lot to do with, not shaping their personalities, but maybe, getting them on the same page in that regard. Would you agree with that?
I would, although I don't think it was easy as it sounds, because those guys were very, very competitive, right? And they had been independent programs before they joined the conference. So they were used to having their own way and not having to look out for the collective good of other programs. So strong personalities, very competitive guys. And frankly, I think my dad and my mother as well, you may be surprised to hear, they would work really hard at like the Big East annual meetings, for example, to make sure that coaches who had recruiting dust-ups or even fights in games that, back then that was pretty common. There were fights in games that, that they would make sure that those coaches would sit at the same table together, or they'd be in the same golf foursome, and they would force them to have relationships off the court that they were, fighting to struggle to have, on the court. And I do think over the course of time that kind of collective effort to work together to build something special that would benefit all the schools and all the programs and all boats would rise was really effective. And when you think back to the early years of the Big East, there were some real bottom dwellers, Providence College, Seton Hall University, that were always playing the 8-9 game. But because the conference did so well, those two programs, among every other one, eventually had incredible national success. Seton Hall going to the national championship game in 1989 with P.J. Carlesimo, Providence College going to the Final Four with Rick Pitino in 1987. So it wasn't just the blue bloods. It was that collective effort you speak about, Mark, that everybody kind of bought in. Mm-hmm. And I do think my dad had a lot to do with that, because the coaches trusted him. Mm-hmm. Because he was a former coach, because he could speak to them differently than maybe someone who hadn't had the experience or background that he had and they shared. Probably had a lot to do with creating that trust and buying into things like the Big Ten ACC Challenge. I mean, the Big East ACC Challenge. Like that was I think maybe the first that I can remember intra-conference matchup like that the coaches did not like. They didn't want to do that at first, because they could lose games and they didn't want to put themselves in that position in November, December. But once they realized like what a platform that could be to recruit and to keep guys in the Northeast in the cities that they all had schools representing, they knew that it was a marketing thing and an event that would really benefit the league. And so it was things and initiatives like that were unique that they had to have some trust in, and they bought in, and ultimately they all benefited from it.
Yep. Oh, they certainly did. So Dan, you after college, and I've known you for a long time, and I I say this with all sincerity, and you and I were on a lot of committees together when I coached on the NABC committees and the board of directors, and I think as far as the tournament now, the March Madness that we know of today, and fans watch it, they're tuned in, they lock in. It's always been good, but I think that you took it to a whole nother level. And I say that with all sincerity. I think you've just done this amazing job. But if I were to go back, and this was kind of pre you and I getting to know one another, how did that come about? How did the role emerge for you to end up in the position you're in now, where you're basically, and I'll say it, I know you don't like to say it, but I will say it, basically running the entire tournament, which is, in my view, what you do. But how did all that kind of come about?
Well, you're very generous, and you were an incredible partner. You mentioned how we worked together on committees and the like, and you always brought so many creative and valuable ideas and thinking to all of our work. So we'll never thank you enough for that when you were in your active coaching days, Mark. I was very fortunate. There was a guy named Tom Jernstead that worked at the NCAA for almost 40 years that is since passed, unfortunately. He's in the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. He's considered the grandfather of the Final Four, and the guy that kind of helped to make this event so special, that grew it from the time he started at the NCAA in the early 70s to the incredible event that it is today. And I'm just lucky with the staff that I work with, Joanne Scott and others, to have taken over from his stewardship and try to build on his incredible legacy with March Madness and the Final Four. Look, we keep the teams, central in all of our thinking. The players and coaches' experience, their families, they're always core to what we do to try to make that tournament experience special. And then, of course, the fans as well. We've got great broadcast partners in CBS and TNT Sports. And, we just feel lucky to have the opportunity to work on this magical event that the country embraces. And our women's championship as well, which has grown so much here in the last number of years. It just makes for an incredible month of March. And it's something that, as you know, because you took, I think you were a part of 4 different schools and many, many, many teams that went to the NCAA tournament, including a national championship at UCLA in '95. I think we're at 30 years now from was it anniversary?
It's a long time.
It takes the whole country to pull off this event. We have 14 different sites from the first 4 to the Final Four. We have host institutions and conferences that helped us to put the event on with the basketball committee, and it's something that the whole basketball community takes an enormous amount of pride in. And so just to be a small part of that legacy of over 80 years of success in this tournament is kind of cool, and we're going to keep trying not to screw it up and make it better year over year.
Well, you've done that, Dan. So let me ask you this one, because I'm always curious about this. So, I played in the tournament as a player at Alabama. Wonderful experience, 3 Sweet 16s. We never got to the Final Four, but we were really good. But it seems like somewhere after those late 80s and into the 90s, maybe even into the 2000s, the marketing of the tournament kind of shifted to where the branding of March Madness, the courts being similar, except you have the names of the sites, whether it's, Charlotte or Seattle, whatever, what cities may be hosting. But the marketing of the tournament went to a whole nother level. And I always used to tell my players, it's the greatest show on earth. I mean, the Super Bowl is amazing. College football playoffs amazing. But the basketball tournament captures the imagination of everybody in America. I mean, everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a teacher, a janitor, a lawyer, everybody's interested. But you guys have done such a good job of marketing it. Talk about kind of the genesis of that, because that really, I think, raised everything to a whole nother level.
Well, I agree. Well, I think you have to go all the way back to 1979, of course, and the players and coaches that made it such an iconic event. I mean, 1979 was the year, of course, Michigan State played for the national championship in Utah, Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. It was the most watched college basketball game ever to this day, and that got the country's attention for sure, especially given the careers that Magic and Larry went on to have in the NBA. And then the '80s and early '90s, with Michael Jordan, and you could go year by year in the '80s and think about iconic moments that happened during the tournament. In the Final Four and the national championship games, but then also just the upsets. I think that's what started to happen as much probably in the '90s, as you mentioned, that the upsets in the first round, the second round, the regionals. That's where I think the March Madness and the David and Goliath, the Cinderella story, started to really take root. And it also corresponded a little over almost 20 years ago now, about 15 years ago, with TNT Sports joining CBS as the broadcast partner for the tournament. Because fans may remember that up until that point, all the games of the tournament were regionalized. So in the early rounds of the tournament, you might be watching a game that Alabama's playing in, and then it gets out of hand, and someone at CBS decides to switch over to cover a game that's closer down the stretch, which was not satisfying to fans, right? In an evolving media marketplace where everybody had a chance to watch anything they wanted, anytime they wanted. TNT Sports joining CBS in 2010 and fully nationalizing every single game to be on either CBS, TNT, TBS, or True TV dramatically changed how the country engaged with the tournament, because now you could watch every single game and just kind of binge on March Madness for 3 straight weeks. And that's also around the time period that we embrace some of the branding around the bracket. The bracket is one of the most brilliant and simple marketing tools the tournament has. It's, as you note, why people engage in the tournament, whether you're a fan or not, casual or otherwise. You fill out your bracket and you have a pool, or you do it with your family and friends, and so that's a huge part of it. We started to incorporate some of the branding, visuals into the courts and into the March Madness logo. And I think that had a lot to do with the broadcast partners, the branding around the bracket. And of course, really the players and coaches were the ones that ultimately kind of got this on a rocket ship course to where it is today.
You mentioned when TNT got involved, but it's so true, because when you're watching games, and you also get to know the teams a little bit better too, because you're not just watching that one game or one, in your area. All of a sudden, I'm watching, Robert Morris College play Gonzaga, and they're playing in LA, although I live in Atlanta or wherever it may be. And so all of a sudden, you're starting to get to know their teams a little bit better, and you've watched a little bit, and now I'm excited about that game. And so it almost kind of brought it, it just made it more intimate, because you get so much more. And obviously, they've been an amazing partner for the NCAA tournament with all of those different platforms to watch the games on. I think you made a great point. That's just it changed the game in my view. Even as a fan, who obviously I want to play and coach in it, but as a fan, I can see all of it now, and it's such a better opportunity.
Yeah, March Madness Live is the digital product that we have with CBS and TNT. So if you don't have a cable subscription, you can watch games, on your tablet or your phone on March Madness Live. So younger fans engage that way. Of course, social media is a huge portion of what they cover the tournament with, and then something as simple as the CBS or the March Madness All Access series. They embed with teams during the tournament, and so they're with the team at a team meal, a shoot around, on a plane or bus, going into the locker room, into the arena, things like that really, get fans excited about getting to know players, coaches, and their story, and or even Sister Jean, someone who may not be part of a team but is part of the story of March Madness.
Dan, how about the how do you weigh this with the rub a little bit in that? I grew up when I was younger. I was in Salt Lake City in 1979 as probably a 14 or 15-year-old watching Bird and Magic. I was in Indianapolis, 81, when Isaiah Thomas in Indiana won it. 80 in Indianapolis. 80 I think if I have this one right, in New Orleans. I mean, I was at all those games. But traditionally, the tournament and the Final Four was in a smaller arena. You're talking about in Utah, at University of Utah's campus in the Huntsman Center. And then there was this shift all of a sudden said, okay, we're going to take this to large venues, sizes. Now we're in the ATT, basically football stadiums, and we're going to find those, New Orleans, San Antonio, and you go around the country, Indianapolis, and so forth. And I'm sure the money was just so much more money. You're selling so many more tickets. But that had to be a little bit of in your conversations, because you're losing a little bit of intimacy, but you're gaining so much more financially.
Sure. Well, all that happened before I got to the NCAA. It was the brilliance of Tom Jernstedt and Greg Shaheen and others who made those decisions. I think 1997 was the first year the Final Four was played not in a traditional arena. What moved to, as you know, a football-sized stadium. Originally, they used to play those games in an end zone, essentially, of the football stadium. So it was, a half the stadium that had the seating capacity. But in 2009, in Detroit, was the first year that the court was put in the middle of the football stadium, and it's been that way ever since. So now the Final Four can accommodate at least 65,000 fans, sometimes upwards of 75,000 plus. And it has become a spectacle, and it certainly is. The revenue is significant for the NCAA with the ticket sales, but it really is just, the demand for the tickets as much as anything, Mark. We talked about during my 12 years at the NCAA, maybe, is there a year maybe to celebrate something, an anniversary, that we'd want to take it back to the traditional arena and just, have a kind of a throwback experience? But the reality is, too many fans want to go to the Final Four, and even the 4 schools that make it, Purdue this year hadn't been to the Final Four since, 1980, I think. And, they had so many fans that wanted to be there, generations of fans, that to play it in a smaller venue would really limit those fans that could attend. And so we're pretty committed to playing in the larger venues. And we think it provides an incredible experience for the players too. I mean, you can play in the NBA, become a Hall of Famer, play in the Olympics, and you'll likely never play in front of 70,000 fans, except if you play in the Final Four. And so it's still a pretty cool experience for the players.
And people have asked me all the time, because when I coached, you play in those big arenas, does it affect, the vision of players and their shooting? Because, the background and all that. And I go back to 1995 when I was at UCLA. We played in the Kingdome, which is no longer, they've torn that building down. But when the ball goes in the air and the popcorn's popping, I don't think players, they figure it out real quick, and they play. And what's been interesting over the years, like you mentioned, how at one time the court was almost in an end zone of a football field, but now almost the pitch of the seating is so good, the way that you guys have done it, to where, everybody's still, even though you're sometimes farther away, you still have a good view of the game. You can still watch the game in a good view if you're there in person. And I'm sure that was probably a little bit of trying to figure out how we're going to do that as we go into these big arenas.
Sure, we got great partners, and fans, especially engineering fans, will be fascinated to see how we put that all together, because we actually have a seating system that overlays the football NFL seating in these stadiums, because the only way to make the visual sight lines work is to build the court onto a deck, which is about 3.5, 4 feet high, and then build our seating system that goes up to the court or just below it, so the sight lines are appropriate, and we can accommodate 70, 75,000 people. So it's a bit of an engineering masterpiece to put it all together. It takes 2 or 3 weeks to build out the stadium to accommodate the Final Four, but it works really well, and it's been refined over time. And we have the players' families that are right down there by the court. The bench is a little bit below the court, so the players have to step up to get onto the court. It's a really cool experience, and something I know every player, once they've had an opportunity to experience it, will never forget for their lifetime.
I've talked to a lot of coaches, and I never had the opportunity to be a head coach in the Final Four, something I always wanted to do. But those guys will tell me, like I've talked with Jay Wright and different guys, all of a sudden you're kind of sitting on that stool because you are up. The benches are down. and it's just a little different than you've been the whole year. All of a sudden, you're kind of sitting there by yourself, and some guys feel a tad bit awkward, because you're kind of out there right in front, and other guys, they're fine with it. But those are little things that the casual fan probably never pays attention to or notices, but it's different. It's just different than in a traditional, what we would call the basketball arenas for everybody. Have you ever had some coaches ever comment or say, this is a little bit strange sitting up here all by myself on this little stool?
Of course, I get lucky to sit near the bench, as in a lot of these games, and have a great relationship with so many coaches, and they'll remark funny things here or there, like, wow, this is feels weird. We have little stools for coaches to sit on now. We probably have to give Bob Huggins credit for that, because I think he used a stool even before he got to the Final Four, and I think he used to it. Your point about the shooting, like the teams get a good 2 or 3 chances to be in the Final Four venue to practice, to shoot, before the day of the game of the semifinals anyway. So by the time they get to playing the game, they're very familiar with the surroundings, the difference of it. We've yet to find a team that's not excited to be there.
Oh, no, that's not. They're all going to be excited to be there. Let me ask you this one, Dan. So the women's game has grown. It's amazing. And I think this year, and I'm curious as your opinion, but the momentum behind women's college basketball, obviously Caitlin Clark and her story and the way she played, and so fun to watch. But the teams are, and their game has gotten so much better too. The girls are a lot better than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago, in my view. But the growth of the women's game, alongside of what has already kind of been and still continue to grow in the men's game, has to be something that, you guys, that has to be pretty exciting to watch that kind of coincide with each other at the same time.
Yeah, it sure is. The quality of play is outstanding. The personalities of the players, quality of the coaching, and the interesting thing about women's basketball, as we know now too, is that because of the WNBA rules, the NBA rules in terms of draft eligibility, and NIL opportunities that players have, women's basketball players have as much, if not more, of an opportunity to build a brand and a following than men's players do, because they do stay in school for 3 or 4 years before they're eligible for the WNBA draft. So, Caitlin Clark, Juju Watkins, who's now a sophomore, will play this year in college and play next year in college. And Paige Beckers has played, 4 or 5 years now. So, the personalities are big. The name recognition, the continuity with programs is a little bit different in women's basketball than men's. I think the women's game has benefited from that. Bigger stars in some ways, because the best players stay in school longer than the men's players do, although that's changing a little bit with NIL and the men's game as well. But yeah, it's very gratifying to see the growth. And it's so fun for March now, because we stagger the tournament dates, almost every single day of March, you've got a men's or women's basketball game being played, right? And whether it's on CBS and WBD, TNT for the men's tournament, or ESPN for the women's tournament, if you're a fan of basketball, there's plenty of it in March and early April.
Hey, everyone, if you're enjoying the content on this podcast, I would encourage you to hit the like and the subscribe buttons. Your involvement in this show allows me to continue to bring you amazing, high-achieving guests. Thank you so much for your support. Dan, I'm sure you've been asked this question 1,000 times here in the last, especially since this last Final Four with Caitlin Clark in Iowa. But the potentially ever combining the two into one city, or is your view and the view of the people there that work with you, is it better to let the women stand on their own 2 feet as the men without maybe combining it? Because the men play Saturday, Monday, where you could, if you really wanted to, you could go women Friday, Sunday in the same city. Now, logistically, maybe a nightmare, but what's the conversations like when it comes to that topic?
Yeah, it's been considered, Mark. Some recommendation by some, to do that even now, the basketball committees who manage these two incredible tournaments very much considered just a couple of years ago, before future Final Four sites were awarded, and they decided to do what you just described as the latter, is to keep them separate in terms of the cities they're played in for the time being, to allow them to continue to both to grow, because the women's tournament is on such a strong trajectory. Wanted to make sure that it continued to have opportunity to grow as its own, magnificent event, and not potentially be overshadowed or share the stage with the men's event. But there's consideration, I think, that will happen several years from now to whether the time is right to consider having both events in the same city on the same weekend. There are some efficiencies and some things you can imagine would be pretty cool about that, around events, around both Final Fours. But for the time being, at least through the early 2030s, we're going to keep both events separate, different cities.
Do you find, Dan, that there's so many logistical things, and these are things that the normal fan they don't ever even consider. They just turn their television on and they watch their team play. But I've been in situations where, like, the travel to get 68 men's teams, you have the women's teams, everybody's heading around to the country, and in the era of chartered airplanes, and now you got your plane flying. I've had some that have been seamless and wonderful, and then I've had a couple of snafus along the way where it's like, can't get a plane here just yet, because there's a lot of parts to this. The general fan, they turn the TV on and they watch the game, but they don't have any idea leading up to the game everything that has happened from the selection show to the first game. And I know for you guys got in this amazing team, but the logistics of all that kind of stuff, just for Joe fan out there, they got no idea. And nor should they know. They're not paying attention to that. But there's a whole lot more goes into that than people realize.
Yeah, without doubt. Well, there's 68 men's teams, 68 women's teams. The first weekend of the tournament, the women's tournament was played in 16 different sites. The men's tournament was played in 9 different sites, first 4, and then 8 first and second round sites. So the men's tournament starts less than 48 hours after Selection Sunday. So those 4 teams have to be in Dayton, ready to play after having practiced and gone through press conferences less than 48 hours after a name is called. Women's starts the next day, same kind of deal. And then, of course, every single team has to be somewhere by Friday and Saturday to play their first round game. So there's an awful lot of charter flights that move around the country, because every team that isn't within 350 miles, I believe, of the site, if they're that close, they bus in. But otherwise, they're flying by charter to go where they're going, and it's quite a logistical challenge that first week. But it's part of the madness, and it works. And schools are great about understanding that. It is different because, as when you're scheduling your travel as a head coach, your schedule weeks and months in advance. So you can arrange for the charter aircraft to be available at your beck and call. But when you release a bracket of 2 different brackets of 68 teams, and then everybody traveling the next day, it's a bit of a fire drill to get them to where they need to be safely and on time. And our staff does a really good job with that, but it's part of the experience, part of the madness, man. It's just what it is.
It's unbelievable how much, and even as coaches, you got to have some patience a little bit, because we're like, I want it now, and when's the plane, and we're going, and I want to know what time, but you also have to realize there's a lot of parts to this as well, and then hotels, and then you have tickets on top of that, and you've got players' families traveling, and so your staff, I'm sure you've got a ton of people involved helping you, because this is not just like putting on a neighborhood tournament down the street. This is a little bigger than that.
No doubt. Well, the experience we had, unfortunately, in 2021, when we had the 2 tournaments in bubbles, essentially, in Indianapolis for the men and San Antonio for the women, created its own challenges around COVID testing, making sure that we had safe protocols and all the rest. But one of the nice things, I think, for the players and coaches, maybe coaches in particular, about that is they traveled in once, and if they kept winning, they just stayed. They didn't go anywhere else. They didn't have to worry about ticket requests from family members and friends and former players. They were just in their bubble with their team and playing pickleball and having team meetings and team shoot-arounds, and so it really simplified the experience. Of course, we don't ever want to go through that again for other reasons, but it really was a cool experience for those teams that were able to be in those environments. And it's kind of like an AAU event, where you just kind of like in one place for a weekend and playing until you lose.
Dan, I've had this conversation so many times, especially when I was coaching, but a lot of people felt like or feel like the selection committee, and I've been with you in Indianapolis where we've actually done mock selections where the people who are literally on the committee, they're on the committee, and we that were on our coaches association, our board, we got to sit with them, and you get to understand how it kind of works to select, the now 68 teams. And people always there's always a conspiracy. You put that team against that team on purpose to get this, and it's higher television ratings if they did that on purpose, and I'm at Murray State, and I've got to play Rhode Island. It's Jim Herrick, who I coached with at UCLA, and all of a sudden it's like, of all the people in the tournament, I don't want to play against him, and he doesn't want to play against me. But explain a little bit about how the committee, you select the teams, and then all of a sudden the seeding, the 4 regions, 1 through 16, and there's a lot to that as well. But in my view, I tell people all the time, it's the purest thing I think there is. And some people are skeptical about the NCAA, but I just tell people I think it's as pure as it can be, in my view, from having sat with those guys and been through that exercise. So talk a little bit about that, because most people don't really understand all that stuff.
Sure. Well, as a committee of 12 that selects seeds and brackets the tournament, they're athletic directors or conference commissioners. They're volunteers. They're not getting paid to do it. They consider it the highlight of their career to have a chance to serve on the men's basketball committee, women's basketball committee. And they take it very seriously, because they all have their own teams and they've all had their own experiences. They know how important it is to every player, every coach. And they take it very seriously. They work at it from the very first day of the season until the very last conference tournament game to do their best they can to evaluate teams. Of course, there's 31 now this year automatic qualifiers that they don't have any say in. That's just the tournament champions. And then there's 37 this year at-large teams that they'll select. Then they seed the entire field, 1 through 68. That's their work, is selecting those 37 teams, seeding the entire field. That takes days. That goes from Wednesday when they get into town until Sunday morning when they finalize the seed list. And then Sunday, the biggest surprise of all, I think, for fans, and you experienced this when you went through that mock with your coaching colleagues, is that the bracketing part of it, that people have these conspiracy theories about, that you matched up this team or that team, that all takes place within a couple of hours on Sunday, because there's 5 conference championship games on Sunday, and then CBS gets the bracket by 5 o'clock for the 6 o'clock show. So you can't even bracket the field until Sunday. You only have a few hours to do that. And there's very kind of defined principles and procedures about keeping teams from the same conference apart, not allowing teams to play Troy in the tournament if they played during the regular season. So it's a pretty kind of automated process in some ways that sets up the bracket. And it certainly doesn't entail, a bunch of people sitting in a room saying, man, it would be really interesting to see, Mark Gottfried coach against his former, head coach from UCLA. And that just doesn't happen. It happens sometimes because, it's a small business. And at some point you'll have played with or coached against someone. And it does happen occasionally, but it's certainly not cooked up that way. And I agree with you. It's a very, well thought out and very clearly defined process if you want to read about how it all happens. And the beauty of it is, man, it's March Madness, and you can think anything you want, but at some point you got to go and play who you're matched up with. And there's going to be upsets, and there's going to be great games. There's going to be a national champion that's determined 6 or 7 games after they start.
Would you agree, Dan? Because I think and again, I wasn't on the committee, but I was able to sit in and kind of do a mock. But selecting the last couple of teams. It's going to come down to, it's not 100 teams. There's a finite limit. There's going to be a cutoff, and you're always going to get down to those couple, 2 or 3 or 4 teams that are relatively close. I mean, they're close, and I've been on that side of it. One of my teams at Alabama, I think we might have been the last team and we were in the 8-9 seeded game, and we actually ended up going to the Elite Eight that year. But selecting the last couple of teams, and then also kind of, you're looking at the board. If I'm on that committee and I'm saying the seeding of a team, like, is this team really a 5 seed, or are they a 4 seed or a 3? And, sometimes that does make a difference. Like, to you as an observer, you're not voting on that. You're not sitting in there, but you're a part of it. Which do you think is harder, the seeding or those last couple? How do we decide between A and B?
Well, the biggest anxiety certainly comes from those last teams that are selected in the fields. I mean, there's no question that those are the hardest decisions the committee has to make, because they know that, they're going to disappoint any number of teams that don't make the field. And, at that point, you are comparing, a small group of teams against each other, and the resumes all generally look very similar. They've got pluses, but they got a bunch of minuses, and, eyes of the beholder, you could make a reasonable case for one over the other. Ultimately, the group of 12 has to make a collective decision on who's in and who's out. And it is in, who's out. Because, I always say, like, when they say, well, this team should have been in, well, the next question is, like, who's coming out of the field to put them in? Because it's a 1-for-1. Right. It's a 1-for-1 deal, right? There's only 68 that can be in the field. But that weighs heavily on each committee that I've had the honor to help support and work with. The seating is also very challenging, and they spend an enormous amount of time on that. Probably spend more collective time on the seeding than they do even those last few selecting teams, because you really select the last few teams on Saturday night. You're down. You don't know who those teams are going to be until all the games have played out on Friday and Saturday. But you start seeding on Wednesday, Thursday, and so, like, you're trying, to just define, refine that every day to make it a little bit more accurate, and it is critically important, and they take that very seriously as well. But, you can play your way out of a bad seed. If you don't make the tournament, you can't play your way in.
That's right.
And that's I think it weighs most heavily on the committee.
One of the years that I was with you in Indianapolis, and I can't remember, I have to go back, but I think at the time Mike Oresco was with CBS, but they came in and kind of talked to us a little bit, our committee, the coaches on our board of directors, but, on some of how they go about it. It was very, very interesting. But negotiating a TV contract, when now that you have CBS and now TNT's involved, and that has to be just talk about that process, because for you that's monumental. I mean, we're not talking about horse feed money here. We're talking about some big money, and the way you guys have done it, I think, has been really spectacular. But talk about some of those negotiations, if you can, a little bit, and kind of how all that comes together for the general fan who really wouldn't know any more about it.
I've been lucky. I now, as part of my responsibilities, in addition to the basketball championships, I oversee our media relationships and our broadcast services group. And so the most recent experience I've had is helping lead our negotiations with ESPN for the NCAA Women's Basketball Championship rights, as well as all of the other NCAA championships that are on ESPN, not the Men's Basketball Championship, but really every other NCAA championship, College World Series, Women's College World Series. We just finished that negotiation in January of this year, just about a year ago. Really interesting work. It's, as you notice, really important to get the right media deal in place, both financially as well as just for exposure and marketing of our sports and championships. And it's such a dynamic marketplace now with streamers and with so many media companies and live sports rights being so valuable in the entertainment industry. So it's an interesting part of my job. I was also part of the group that helped to renegotiate our extension with CBS and WBD, Warner Bros. Discovery, here just back a few years ago. It's the first year of our extension with them that goes out through 2032. And I was fortunate back in my conference office days before I came to the NCAA to work with ESPN as the Big East rights holder and CBS and get to know that business a little bit and followed it closely just out of interest in professional development. And now that I've got that responsibility, and it's such a big part of our business, and it's so fundamental to any event in any league or any property that that's embraced like our championships are. And we've got great partners. We're really lucky to have CBS and TNT Sports and ESPN, leaders in the industry that embrace our championships and promote and broadcast them and distribute them so widely.
Has there ever been a time, Dan, and especially with the men's basketball tournament, where you're going to walk into those meetings and the very beginning you're just like worlds and worlds apart, or is it somewhat like we kind of have an idea where we're going to end up, or again, because we're talking about, I think you can tell me the last TV rights just for the men's tournament was it 10 billion? Was it something like that? Wasn't it a long-term? It was a long-term deal. So to get to that point, where do we begin? It's like buying a house. We got to figure out where we are here and start negotiating.
Yeah, it's not for the weak of heart. I would tell you that, because these dollar figures are big. I mean, the men's tournament rights, as you note, are this last extension is worth $8.8 billion, an average annual value of $1.1 billion for a 3-week, 67-game tournament. And our recent deal with ESPN for the NCAA championships, including the women's tournament, is for $920 million, $115 million over 8 years. So the art of the negotiation is art and science behind it. We have consultants that help us, to try to value our rights and then take them to market. But usually you do start the process pretty dramatically different places financially, because the media companies have to understand their costs and how they can monetize those rights in the advertising marketplace. And the property rights holder like us is trying to, maximize the value of our property and our content and our rights. And so you usually do start pretty dramatically in different places and then, negotiate to a place where all parties are pleased. And the best deals, of course, are those that are good for every partner, right? And I think in our case, we have really good media deals in place that are beneficial to the NCAA and beneficial to our broadcast partners as well.
How tricky was it to bring TNT in? Because for a long time, it was basically CBS, correct? And then we brought TNT with their platforms, with True and TNT and TBS and their platforms. But how tricky was that to bring that in to get more exposure?
Well, I was not here at the time when that deal was initially struck in 2010, but I know many of the players that were, and I think a lot of credit to David Levy from Turner Sports at the time, who was the CEO there, and Sean McManus, the chair of CBS Sports. Those were the two masterminds behind partnering two very competitive media companies. It really is a model that is very unique in our business, has been duplicated since, but at the time, it was probably the first time that I can recall that two competitive media companies partnered on a rights deal like this. I think they really needed each other, from what I understand. I mean, the rights were getting to a point where they were, maybe too expensive in some ways, or close to being too expensive for CBS. Turner could bring the 3 different networks into the equation, nationalize all those games, spread the advertising opportunity throughout all 67 games, could bring the financial might of the Turner networks as well to the deal. And so it just worked for all parties. But it did take creative thinking. It took real great leadership from both David Levy and Sean McManus to imagine how something very different could work. And it's worked brilliantly. I mean, it has become a model you've seen now in many other deals, conference deals and the like. We've got multiple media partners. The NBA, recently made a deal with 3 different media partners, right? And so it's become more commonplace, but I'd say back, almost 15 years ago now, it was a unique and new thing that took some guts and some bravery to pull off. And I think it benefited the NCAA benefited March Madness, and it certainly benefited our two partners as well.
And the fans, they benefited because they get to see, much more basketball. And like we talked about earlier, talk about this, Dan, because I'm curious on this one. As conferences, so, everything evolves. Everything seems to change over time, and we're in this period right now where you've got conference realignment, the Pac-12, which I participated in as a coach for 7 years, which was the Pac-10 way back then, but that's kind of dissolved for right now until they can kind of get their footing again. But, the Big Ten is becoming, I don't know how many teams. I think there's 18 now. I think the SEC is up to maybe 18 universities and then the SEC and the ACC. We've got Stanford and Cal playing in the ACC. But when it comes to the tournament, that's got to present some challenges maybe that didn't exist 5-10 years ago, because this is changing rapidly, and you're still wanting a conference champion. The automatic berths the number of conferences could go down, but kind of talk. I mean, that's a big question, but there's a lot to unpack in all that as conferences are realigning, it seems to me.
Very much so, and as we know, the conference realignment has largely been driven by football membership and by media rights opportunities for the conferences and the schools that have these opportunities to migrate from one conference to another. And it has created an interesting dynamic that we have to think about for the basketball championships and how we select seed and bracket the fields. It wasn't that long ago there were 5 major conferences that have played football and basketball. And now there are 4, right? Pending, how the Pac-12 reconstitutes itself here. And the size of the conferences, as you note, has changed dramatically. Back several years ago, the 5 leagues were anywhere from a 10-team league in the Big 12 to a 16-team league. Now there are 2 at 16 and 2 at 18. So how does that impact how the field is selected, seeded, and bracketed? There's more conference games that are being played. Not every team is playing in their conference championship. You still have regular season champions, but it's a little different when you're not playing a double round robin and not playing everybody the same number of times. So the committee has to look at how that all plays out in terms of evaluating teams, and it's even driving some of the consideration, frankly, around whether the tournament should expand in size from 68 and get a little bit larger, has been proposed and recommended, and it's been a topic that's been considered before. But in my 12 years, it's really the first time I think that the committees have really taken seriously the idea of potentially expanding the tournament's fields. No decision, on that, no imminent decision, and no intended outcome. But as the membership kind of evolves and the landscape changes, you have to consider how that impacts the tournament and what it looks like today and going forward, and not just be kind of beholden to the past when the setup was quite different.
Mm-hmm. Dan, is the with the obviously NIL, that's a whole new ball game nowadays for everybody, and it's an interesting thing, which I think most coaches for the most part agree that it's nice to be able for student athletes to make money. I personally, that's my personal opinion. I'm happy about it. Is there ever a time when you guys begin to feel a little bit like, like right now, a lot of the players, whether it's through their agents or collectives at each school, but where they start zeroing in and saying, we need a share of the tournament. We should have a share. We're playing. We're participating. Is that, I don't even know if you can dive into that deep, but does that come up a lot with this whole new, as we open the box of the whole NIL and how it affects everyday life in college sports?
Well, I think we have to think about everything that's going on in the industry. There's a lot of change all happening at once between NIL, transfer portal, professional opportunities, you name it. We have this House court settlement that is in the proceeding right now, potentially being approved in April. It's been preliminarily approved by the courts. That would set up a revenue sharing opportunity for schools to engage with their student athletes in a very formal way that would help mitigate some of this, I think. We'll see how that all plays out. But we're monitoring it and figuring out how, working with our conferences and athletic directors and coaches, we try to create a different future that benefits student athletes appropriately, and yet hopefully at some point, maybe with the help of Congress and others, has some kind of a structure to it that can be managed, because right now it's awful hard to manage what's a very kind of decentralized scenario for coaches and trying to manage rosters and opportunities for student athletes.
Yeah, and I sometimes can't imagine. I talk to all my friends who are still coaching, and it's an interesting thing. And my hope is, I've said this many times, and with my teams, Dan, the NCAA basketball tournament, I've always said it's the greatest show on earth. To me, nothing else captures everyone's attention, their excitement. And my fear or my hope is that I just hope nothing happens in a negative way where, players say, hey, we're not going to play, or they're going to boycott unless they get money. And I just don't know who's driving some of this. You just can't tell anymore. It's a whole different animal out there. And so my hope is we're not going to see anything like that. But I'm nervous about it, to be quite honest, because there's a grab bag a little bit for money at times, and I hope that we don't ever see that happen, because the tournament is too good. It's too good, and it's too wonderful. It's so exciting. There's so many amazing stories, but I just hope we don't ever see anything like that. And I'm sure you feel the same.
Well, it's a great experience. It's a great opportunity for lifetime memories for players to participate. It's also an incredible opportunity and platform, to promote them as athletes, as individuals, and to provide those opportunities for NIL and other professional opportunities in their future that is very unique. And so we're trying to be supportive of that and mindful that it's just a new era, and that we have to think about things a little bit differently. I think we are, and yet still make sure that the experience for every year is the way it should be. Is just a first class lifetime experience that's second to none.
Well, I hope, Dan, that the people that listen, this has been it's an incredible episode, but it's informative. And like I talked about at the beginning, a lot of people turn on the TV, they watch March Madness, they fill out their bracket, but they got no idea, really behind the curtain what's going on. And I tell people this all the time. And I say this with all sincerity, Dan. The tournament was an amazing tournament. But I think since you've gotten involved in the NCAA, I think it's the best decision they've ever made is to bring you on board. It's gone from an amazing tournament to a spectacular men's and women's, an event. So congratulations, man. I'm sincere when I say it. You've taken it to another level. And congratulations. So great job.
That means a lot coming from you. You're one of the most genuine people I've had the good fortune of calling a friend for a very long time. And I know you speak with sincerity from the heart. So thanks. I'll pass it on to our staff, because we take a lot of pride in this, and we work hard to try to deliver what you're talking about. And I'm glad to know that you feel that way.
Well, thank you, Dan Gavitt, the Senior Vice President of the NCAA Basketball, the tournament, and just done a great job. So thank you, man, for coming on the show. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Mark. Enjoy the season.
All right, Dan. Have a good one.